works.
This meeting is being recorded.
All right,
Well,
so Tal, the floor is yours to go over the component diagram that you started putting together. Thank you.
Okay, did sharing work?
Yes, it's very small though, but we can see your screen.
It's small on purpose. So
Okay.
People can also open the link. I don't know if you can share it in the chat, please,
Yes.
to follow along on themselves. So let me give you some background to this. I prepared this a year ago, actually. It was done internally and evolved since then. This is not exactly what I had a year ago, but the point of the exercise I was doing was exactly what Alexei was alluding to, that we never had a very clear architecture, although some people would argue that our architecture is there, of course, it's emergent, right? Obviously, we have an architecture, we have something that works, but we didn't really have architecture design and plan. It was kind of an ad hoc, and still is, back and forth between SIG 1, SIG 2, but there's no master document per se that can tell you what it is. John might disagree, right? John wrote several documents that he would consider, here's the architecture. But I would argue that the approach there was more about, hey, this is Porch's architecture, and this is how it applies to Nefio. I don't know if we had an architecture that comes from the Nefio point of view. Not to say that that John's architecture is wrong. It's just coming from a different angle, right? And I think the two can meet and do meet, right, in practice. So with that in mind, I want to go over this and kind of give you my vision of how I think things should work and going there from where we are right now, right? So the color coding here, green is all the Nefio components, and you'll see there's not too many. There's this deployment initializer on top, a deployment preparer. I'm separating these two. There's a Nefio UI component here on the side. There's not too much to say about that. There's something called a meta scheduler that you're probably wondering what the hell I'm talking about. And then there are two components in the workload cluster. And those are kind of important because, let's face it, we've done zero work in the workload cluster so far. Really, all our work was focused on the CNF operator, but as I'm putting it here in the color orange, right, this is work that usually comes from vendors. We've, of course, done it for Free5GC and OAI, but that's because we're onboarding them, right? But that's not Nefio work per se, right? That's not the Nefio platform. In yellow, I'm putting third-party components here. And the idea of thinking more in terms of blue field and brown field, right? The data backends, you'll see that they appear 3 times here. And I mentioned that they could be VCSs, like Git, right? If you're going GitOps. Right now, we have all 3 of these on Git. But I want to point out that they're there for different purposes. And in the real world, sometimes they are separate. Like the blueprint catalog is separate from the site inventory sometimes. So you could potentially unite them in one data source, but often they're separate. So I just want to point that out. Other general big things I can say. Well, yeah, let's dive into the narrative here, right? So the way to read this also is top to bottom. It's kind of the flow. In an early version of this, I call this farm to table, right? How do we go from our crops to our actually deployed and working services, right? The entry point is deployment initializer, right? The idea here is we need a component that goes to the blueprint catalog, right? There's a UI for it, right? That gives us a front end. And it takes those blueprints and puts them in what I'm calling the preparation area. That's all this component does, right? It's very straightforward, but it's the critical one because this is the front end into the entire system. Right now, we're handling it using a special kind of CR called package version, which is supported by one of the Porch controllers. The package version, for those who know, it tells you, it's a very straightforward CR. You give it an upstream pointer to your blueprint and a downstream pointer to the deployment package, right? And that sets everything in motion. That's kind of the entry point or one of the main entry points for Porch. So we have a solution for this right now, but again, it's based on Porch, so it's all designed around what Porch supports, and that's pretty much only using GitOps. It also supports, I should say, putting blueprints in image repositories, right? But we don't have this east-west integration with external catalogs at this point. Next, we're going to, so as I said, it's put in a preparation area. And here I need to talk about what this preparation area is, because it's very critical, I think, to understanding our architecture. It's where we do almost all of the work in FEO right now. Although, again, I said in the future, we also want to do work in the workload cluster. It tends to be synonymous with what we call the management cluster, but I'm changing the name here on purpose because I want to have us think about why we have a management cluster and what job it actually has. It is there for preparing packages for deployment, mostly, right? So we call this process specialization, right? I'm, again, changing the terminology a bit here in my proposal and calling it preparation, right? Because the idea is that all the KRM resources coming here and the packages from the blueprint are incomplete and invalid. They might be missing properties, and they might just have wrong properties, right? So even if they can be validated, they are not correct for whatever site they are going to and for the specific use case, right? So we start off with these unprepared deployment packages, right? And packages here all contain KRM resources. Those are in blue. What preparation does, and this is the deployment prepare here, this component takes those unprepared KRM resources and makes them prepared and valid, right? So it fills in the gap. This is our specialization process. And again, this is part of Porch right now. There are two ways to do this in Porch. We can use kept functions to do these kind of modifications, and we can also write custom controllers. Those are the two main paths, right? So, but here, the important point to understand that all this work takes place in this kind of preparation or staging area, right? We need some place to store this data. We do this right now in a management cluster, but it's kind of a mix of things. Actually, the data backend for it is Git. So we often use the term CRD when we talk, and CRs when we talk about our data, but that's not the actual architecture, right? And I keep reminding people, don't use the term CRD unless it's a real CRD. Most of what we work with in this specialization pipeline is actually an aggregated API, meaning it's not stored in Kubernetes. Kubernetes just aggregates the front end to Porch, while Porch works against the data backend, which is, in this case, is Git. Right? So our staging area is actually stored in Git, most of it, right? There are a few CRs in Porch, and John has talked about making more of them CRs. So why am I not just calling it a management cluster here? Because you can read this comment I'm making on the side. I have evolved my thinking over my years of working on this topic. And there are a lot of advantages to putting all of this in a Kubernetes cluster, right? Because all our components can just be pods and deployments, and our API could just be the Kubernetes API, right? Even if it's aggregated from something else. So we get kind of a coherent area to work with, which we're already familiar with because we're working in Kubernetes, right? We're working towards the workload cluster. But I have very serious scalability concerns about doing this, right? And my friends here at Red Hat can also attest, Red Hat has also taken this management cluster approach with the Red Hat ACM project, Advanced Cluster Manager. We don't know for sure, actually, a single management cluster, how many sites it'll be able to manage, right? Because if in this staging area, we're going to have duplication of all the resources and all the workload clusters, how many workload clusters will be able to handle? We don't know this for sure, right? Kubernetes is designed as a self-orchestrating platform, right? So a cluster is designed ostensibly to support its own pods and services, right? And etcd as a database has been chosen to be very much based on that, right? It's very optimized for that use case, right? Because as your cluster grows, if you have a cluster of 50 nodes versus 100 nodes, right? That's how you know that as you grow the cluster, you can handle more data as well. And then we have Kubernetes distributions that can You can decide how many management nodes you want versus workload nodes. But it's always been optimized for that use case. So if you have a single management cluster that has to manage 100,000 sites with a single order magnitude more of workloads, right? All the pods and everything else, I don't think it can handle it, right? And so we need to start thinking about, you know, how we can scale that out. And I will say that there is work being done in Kubernetes, because we're not the only ones who are thinking about these kinds of use cases, where Kubernetes is being used not to manage its own resources, but to manage resources in other clusters. And people have been making submissions of maybe allowing etcd to be replaced with other data backends and other ideas for scaling Kubernetes for more use cases, right? But this goes beyond what Kubernetes was designed for originally. All I'm saying is that, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I'll interrupt you, Tal, when there are hand raised, if you don't mind.
Oh, sure, I don't see it. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so I'll take care of that. There is a hand raise from Wim.
Yeah. I want to make the point that today we are not storing any of this in etcd.
Yeah, no, that's a point that I made too, that we're using an aggregated API to store it in Git.
So at the moment, our approach is already dealing with that scale, in my view, right? And I think the question which you are asking yourself is Git enough to do, or can Git handle it? And I think my view is, we have to prove that that doesn't scale somehow. And by the way, we are not tied to Git either, in my view, because we can also use OCI. So in other words, I think the point you are making, we don't really have Tal, because we are not depending on etcd for these things.
Well, okay, if you talk to John, he's actually in favor of moving more things into etcd. we are using etcd, things like package version.
Yeah, okay, but these are very aggregated resources, right? So that is, I mean, see, I've done a bunch of tests, like where I did 1 million objects, CRs in etcd. It didn't give a crack. Okay, but so in other words, and we, even with the architecture we don't have that constraint, in my view. So I think I think we have to be for me, this discussion is, I think, a bit,
well, this is a side discussion, really.
But I'm trying to say that I don't think we have this issue right now. So let's focus on the things that, because we are actually not storing our main so all this million of resources we are not actually storing in etcd. So I don't think let's not make this as an issue because we want to change it. I think that piece, in my view, we already covered reasonably well.
Sure. You've made your point. I'm putting this on as an aside here. I think my point is just to understand why we're using a management cluster. So I don't want to just call it a management cluster. We're using it for a preparation area. That's our main use for it. And we have chosen Kubernetes. And the issue, by the way, Wim, is not just etcd, right? Because it's not just how many you store, right? Because if you're using a client API and going over 1 million records, right, to reconcile them, there are other scalability issues other than just storage, right? It's not a matter of how many records you can handle, but how Kubernetes works in terms of reconciliation as well, right? So there are also ideas of how to shard that. You know, if you have 1 million records that you need to reconcile, your for loop is never going to go over them. So there's an idea that you can actually divide the workload among many pods. People have done experiments with that, but again, the API is not designed for it. Kubernetes is not optimized for that use case, and there are a lot of concerns. But anyway, I'm not talking about changing this right now. I'm just having us understand this in terms of architecture rather than technology. Okay, so that's my point, right? Think of it, this is the use rather than the name of the technology. Okay, so I'll go back to the narrative here. Sorry for that aside. I know I should have probably not even talked about that, but I wanted to explain why I call this preparation area, not management cluster. So the preparer, its job is really to take those packages and fill in the details. And I show here that it can actually work with a site inventory because it might need a lot of data for the actual site. Also, you'll see here that some of the packages are called here unprepared site deployment package versus deployment package, because we can package information for sites, especially if we want to provision them or prepare them as part of Nefio. Although the use case also is the site inventory can already have pre-prepared sites, right? So provisioning new sites is something we want to support in Nefio, but it's not always a requirement, right? There are definitely places where they design all their sites and then they make the deployments, right? This is a workflow issue. I mentioned here too that I think topology controller should be part of this as well, right? So if we get a topology package, which is just another kind of package, it can be exploded into the actual deployment packages, right? And preparation can be involved here too, right? So we can, according to different parameters, we might explode it in different ways, right? So we might have a single topology, but it might be able to work with any number of, I don't know, edge sites. So we can give it 3 edge sites versus 6 edge sites, and it might create different deployment packages. And this could be recursive too, right? We can have topologies inside topologies until at the very end we have the actual deployment packages. So this is our entire specialization pipeline. And then we get all kinds of different resources, right? So here I want to talk about those and what the meta schedule is supposed to do. So we have general Kubernetes resources. So I'm mentioning here standard Kubernetes resources at the bottom. And often, at least what we have right now with Free5GC and OAI is that really all we do is have a CR for the operator and deploy the operator itself, right? So we deploy the operator using a deployment service, general Kubernetes stuff, and we have a CR for the operator. And then the operator here at the bottom will explode and create all the Kubernetes resources at the workload cluster. But this doesn't have to be the case. We can have a package that actually includes all the resources, and also we can package a Helm chart, right? So if we already have that, we can, just fill in the Helm chart values YAML the same way we would fill in a CR. It really ends up being the same here. Technologically, of course, we've talked a lot about Helm support, and I'm very briefly mentioning that we have 3 options for actually handling this values.yaml. We can actually here, as part of preparation, take that values.yaml plus the chart and explode it into the actual resources using the Helm template command, which has various limitations, but then we just, put them in the workload cluster as usual. The meta schedule can handle it too. So it could be handled in this component here, or we can potentially handle it at the workload cluster, which is what Flux does. So Flux has an operator sitting in the workload cluster. It'll detect those things and do it there. So we have a few options. There are pros and cons, and we're still discussing all of these really in SIG 2. But architecture-wise, this is how it looks here, right? All we have to do is fill in values.yaml. We have Kubernetes admin resources, right? Things that you need an admin user to actually create, like RBAC. To create a CRD, you need to be an admin, the namespace for the whole project. So we handle this right now with config sync, which we can, config sync has, I think, a root sync versus another one. So you kind of have to manually put it in the right place if it's an admin resource versus a standard resource. My idea that a meta scheduler, config sync does a lot of work of what this meta schedule proposal I'm putting in. But the other thing that the meta scheduler is important for is these resources, which are the infrastructure requirements, right? So we can have OS requirements, real-time kernel drivers, etc. And we have inter-cluster connectivity requirements, right? If this is a multi-cluster topology, then we might have certain settings about how they connect together. If it's a control plane, management plane, data plane, etc., and they could be connecting to other trunks, right? So the idea here is that the meta scheduler goes over all these packages, all these different resources, and it will know where to schedule them, right? So it sends them onward. So things like standard Kubernetes resources have to go just into the workload cluster, right? A really simple config. But we might, if we're provisioning a new cluster, we might have to wait for that new cluster to come up, right? So the meta scheduler will have to work with the infrastructure manager to say, hey, is the cluster up and ready? It is. Okay, now I can actually sync. Right? And it also has to be able to tell the infrastructure manager what the requirements are for creating that cluster if it's provisioning it. So the meta scheduler is just a general kind of a routing component for KRM, right? Where to put it. So again, we have 3 different buckets, or maybe even 4 if I'm putting the intercluster connectivity manager as a separate component. It often is. So the meta scheduler knows if to talk to the infrastructure manager, use an admin user for the admin resources, or use a standard user for the regular resources. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So for users, all they have to, for the deployment preparer, it doesn't know anything about scheduling. It just knows about this flat declarative space. The meta scheduler takes this flat declarative space here in the staging area and makes sure to schedule them in the right position, right? And my hope is that our UI would be able to look at all these kind of components here, right? So the UI can tell you how deployment initialization is going. It can tell you how the preparation process is going. And it can tell you how the meta scheduling process is going. So it can tell you if everything was scheduled in time. And finally, you know, I don't mention it here, but we have the status aggregation that would I'm including here as part of meta scheduling, because meta scheduling should update its own status. So we could know from a high level if things were successfully scheduled, right? If they actually workload cluster and are working.
Yeah, there's a quick question. There is a question from Bernard.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So I would be interested in 2 things. First of all, I'd like to have the link of this page, and I would like to understand a structured process of how we can comment and enhance sort of the considerations which are captured here.
Yeah, so this is a Google Doc, so I think you can add comments for anything. Yeah, it should be a link. Alexei, could you share the link, please, in the chat?
Yeah,
yes, I did, and I pasted it again.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. The reason why I'm asking is simply writing comments is not a structured process. I was just wanting to understand sort of, let's regard this as a starting point, but we would like to enhance it to a certain level of maturity. And I was just wondering, what would this process look like?
So we've started to discuss this on Slack, but I'll leave it up to Alexei here to manage that process.
Okay, Tal, maybe you can continue with this. Yeah. And Bernard, I'm going to set up a separate Google Doc. I don't have necessarily a structure for it, but let's capture the feedback, questions, outstanding items on that Google Doc, and that way we can have a review on it, and we can iterate from there. Is that a good approach for you, Bernard?
Yeah, and from a communication point of view, I just want to make sure that in this iteration process, we come to a certain result, which is then communicated in a structured way also to all the other parties, so that everyone is aware of the results here and can make use of it as a foundation for, let's say, user journeys and etc. So I just wanted to understand how that would happen as well, because otherwise we are creating a document which is then sort of neglected again, and I don't want to have that happen.
Yeah, and the intention about this meeting we're having now and the 2 outcomes being the architecture and the release scope is exactly to address what you said. So when we come out with a release, we have tangible artifacts such as an architecture and a document talking about it, and such as a release scope where we don't have to rely on Tal to figure out what's the scope in a couple of weeks, like he had to do for R3. So that's exactly some of the reasons for us setting this meeting together, Bernard.
Okay, but then I'd like to have a name for this document so that we can refer to it, and that it should be in the wiki and highlighted, etc., as a reference point.
So yeah, any suggestion you have, Bernard, both on the process and naming things, I'm welcoming them, because I don't have everything fleshed out myself. And this is evolving somewhat organically here. So feel free to ping me on Slack if you have specific ideas that you'd like to implement, because I'm eager to get any ideas at this point. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And I'm willing to, of course, change the name of this to anything and organize it appropriately, or make other changes that will make it easier to consume and by the process. And yeah, to your point, absolutely, this is just the first stab and a very personal way of thinking. And I very much welcome, discussion and counter proposals too, as well. But yeah, it all goes to Alexis's point that, we've never really done this kind of exercise exactly. We've done numerous versions of it, but again, I would say from more the porch perspective, looking how it will apply here, not so much from, hey, what are our needs, and looking to them. But again, it's mapped pretty well. I mentioned here in the text, all these components have an equivalent in porch and config sync. Most of that functionality, I'll say there's some missing functionality, but most of it is already there. This is more about an architectural organization or reorganization, if you will. So let me get. Yeah.
Sorry, I need to interrupt again. Wim also had a hand raise.
Sure.
No, see, the question is the following, right? I mean, we're probably going to have a lot of discussions around these things, right? And so I'm not saying it's not bad, but the question is, I see this as a parallel activity, right? Because what we have been doing so far, at least that has been the discussion, like with John and stuff like that, we are iterating to improve. So our approach has been today the following, right? We have done certain things, right? We have seen that they are not ideal. We have to improve, right? And then we iterate on the approval, right? So what I'm trying to get from it is the following: is if I look to our tree, we will probably have to improve a number of things that we see are not really proper, right? And you go step by step, right? Versus what I see from here is you say, okay, let's take a clean slate and let's say, okay, let's try to come up with the ideal thing. And most likely we don't know everything yet, so we'll have to change again, right? So my question is a little bit, what are we trying to accomplish here?
Yeah.
Because I see what you can do is say, okay, let's throw everything away and let's start from scratch and let's.
That's absolutely not what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yeah, correct. So, but I'm making it black and white just to accelerate.
No, I really appreciate this. I always struggle to present this. Yeah.
Yeah. So the problem is always like, okay, what do? You say, okay, these are the things we need to improve, and we focus on those and we iterate. And then we get it better, because even the view that you present here, I can bet you, Tal, in a year from now, you will see changes. Okay? So this is never going to be, let's say, ideal, and there will be improvements done no matter what, right? So my personal opinion would be, what we should do is take what we have and say, what are the things that we have to improve to go in our tree to make it better, and then we iterate and we iterate and we iterate. You see? So
absolutely,
as a result, you get somewhere. Whereas we can also take it. So this is I'm just wondering what we are trying to achieve.
Okay, I'll tell you what
because we'll have a lot of discussion and debate, and the question is, what will we get out of it eventually?
Okay, I can give you my take. So the point here is that this is functional components, right? I'm not necessarily saying that they're technological ones, right? Two of these functional components can be handled by the same system, right? I'm not necessarily describing systems, although I think they could be systems, right? But in terms of SIG-1 and understanding how we do the north, south, east, west connectivity, right, and integrations, or trying to design a use case, we have to understand what we're working with, right? So as you pointed out, we have two architectures, right? We have an ideal architecture, and we have the emergent architecture that comes out of trying to describe what we have right now, as you pointed out, and that continuously evolves. And that's based on, the technology that we have, the components that are out there, the ways that Kubernetes works, right? So you mentioned, I think you said it very nicely, that these are parallel efforts, right? On the one hand, there's working with the technology that we have and presenting it and understanding and evolving it. On the other hand, and I think we're all smart people, and I think we can take we can walk and chew gum at the same time, as the American phrase works. Right? We are able, I think, to work with the practical architecture that we have that has to do with the components that are out there, but still understand conceptually how we're placing Nephio within our existing orchestration narratives. Right? So I am, at this point, focusing on that more conceptual part. So I'm happy to call this, for example, conceptual components proposal. Right?
Yeah, but okay, you're going in quite a bit of detail, right? So that is the other problem with that I see. If it's conceptual, there's too much detail.
Well, I'm trying to connect the concept to the actual real world,
Yeah.
and not to
So
float
that,
in
and
a
that's and I think the debate is going to be okay if you, because you're calling out specific components and the way they interact and stuff like that. There, and that's where you will probably get a lot of debate.
I think true.
And this is where that's why I'm saying we'll probably can spend the year on this if you are not careful. And then whereas the other approach is, okay, let's say we are now R2, we know the things, there are a number of things that needs to be improved. Let's call them out and let's evolve to get them resolved and improve upon them, right? So,
yeah,
to be honest,
it's not stopping us. Yeah.
To be honest, I like this approach of describing a functional architecture. Yeah, that means not saying this is yet now this CR or this operator or this specific tool, but giving a little bit of guidance of how the different elements are providing certain functionality, which can then be integrated also towards the systems in the north, east, and west, etc. So in this sense, I believe it's a complementary work, structuring a little bit all the developments which we are currently accumulating in these different releases, and giving a little bit of guidance of how this can be sort of also applied when we extend the approach to sort of a larger construct, for instance, in the ORAN integration aspect. So I personally really like this functional aspect to be accompanying the current implementation-specific approaches.
Varda, I see you have also hand raised.
Yeah. Yes, thanks. Yeah, I also echo Bernard. In fact, this is a first functional or component or whatever diagram, conceptual diagram, where I could relate all the swim lanes. So I think we should also, have such types of architecture so that we know where to, move the current architecture towards. Yeah, that's my point.
Thank you, Varda. No, it's definitely a starting point, and I echo the feedback as well. I think we could, Tal, you are right in terms of time boxing. I'm just going to keep like 5 to 10 minutes at the end. I'm going to let you go for another maybe 10.
I'm actually almost done, I think.
Okay, so please go ahead, Tal, and then I'll take it over from there. Thank you.
Sure. I really appreciate all these comments, and especially yours, Wim. The funny thing is, I always agree with you on this. Yes, this will generate a lot of debate. I personally believe, my faith is that it will be good debate, right? Because it'll help. This is the same reason, right, why I was really wanting us to have a modeling work group too, right? Architecture work group, modeling work group. And I think, Wim, your comment about the modeling work group was very similar. You said that, well, the models are all in SIG automation and the code is there, but now we're duplicating things and we're creating parallel work. Well, that's all true, but I think there's productive work to be done here. I'm a code first person. I always believe that all of this, if it's not implemented with a code or at least the POC, is kind of worthless. But you need to be able to talk about the code using human language and human diagrams. So that's what the effort is done here. So it's kind of a two-way street. We're translating our thoughts and designs into code, but we also have to translate the code back into the human language to kind of complete that loop in discussion. It's slow, it's painful, and it could be annoying, but my personal faith is that it's productive. but we'll see. You know, if this ends up being annoying and counterproductive, then we can stop it as well. We don't have to continue the discussion forever. So I'm hoping, Wim, you'll let us go on this ride for a little bit and
No,
see.
no, no. I see. I'm just giving. This was not my real feeling. I basically give a black and white view of the situation, right? I think overall doing this is useful. Don't get me. What I'm trying to say is that not everybody will agree on all the components. For example,
yeah.
For example, like like the meta scheduler, in my view, I don't think it'll work. It has to be distributed, okay? And I can prove you why, right? So, just to give you an example, right? So, and that will result in a lot of discussion and stuff like that. Whereas in my view, I rather prove it and will adopt the diagram. So in other words, to describe what we have done so far, there is too much detail right now in it, right? And I would trim it down from that point of view. That would be my suggestion, and to have and build a conceptual diagram from that, right? And then we iterate on. So the way I would work is because we already know we've done release 2. We know what release 1 is. We know certain improvements that have to be done, right? And we then say we scope the changes on the existing diagram to the release 3 content, or maybe release 4, right, or whatever, and you iterate upon the diagram, you see? And because that's how I would approach this.
Okay,
so you basically take what we have, right, and we basically say in R3, to do these use cases, we are going to add this, that, and that. And in my view, then you are focused on the use cases and you're adding these components to it with the goal to make this improve and improve and improve. And as a result, this serves as a basis to extend the system and improve the system.
Yeah,
it's a different approach.
Exactly. No, that's the second approach that I mentioned, right? That is emergent and based on describing our current architecture and managing it. Again, I'm trying to say that we can do both, and maybe it wasn't a great idea to start with this, which is the first approach versus the second, but this is what I had, and I very much welcome, if you want to take, for the next meeting or sometime to take the opposite approach, or I would say the complementary approach of starting with our current emergent architecture and describing it. That's my whole point. I think the two can meet somewhere in a productive way and have a dialogue between them. Yeah. Anyway, let me move on and just finish this. I think we have a pretty good understanding of what the challenges are here, and the black and white kind of extremes, and maybe there's somewhere in the middle that could be productive for us. So in the workload cluster, I'm recognizing the need for 2 components. One of them I've talked about extensively, and it's the network plane manager, right? And we have a discussion channel on the SIG for it. We had presentations from myself for the KNAP component. We had the Eno folks come in and give really good presentation about fabric management. The point is that it's very hard to create network attachment definitions for Multis. And when I say hard, I don't mean in a kind of hard to think about it. The problem is that they live here in the workload cluster, and they are extremely specific to not only the cluster, but the node, the machine on which they are running for many different kind of network types. The way we handle them right now, actually, in FEO is we can generate them here in the staging area, right? And we have a nice component that can do IMAP injection and a few other things that we can kind of create them for here. But those are very, very specific to our use case right now. And they're very, I would say they don't represent all the uses of Multis that are out there for specifically data planes and management planes, exotic networks, and all the different kinds of specific technologies that you might want to install there, right? I think we're just using Mac VLAN as well, which is a very simplistic, yeah, it's not even a fabric. So my point is that we've talked a lot in the past. We had presentations about having something like a network as a service for Kubernetes, like something like what we have in OpenStack. I'm saying that very cautiously, but we definitely don't want to duplicate OpenStack. We want something that is, OpenStack does overlay networks, and it's very opinionated. We want a general way to have a provider system where we can say, hey, I need this kind of data plane connectivity with these characteristics. This component lives here on the workload cluster. It queried the hardware. It knows what's out there. It knows what software and fabrics are installed. It will be able to create our network attachment definition for us in a safe and valid way, right? And maybe manage day 2 changes as well, right? There are talks about that. So this is something that I think the Kubernetes world is sorely missing, and we're very much in a good place here in Nefio to work on it. So again, this is a proposal. We haven't done any work towards this. We've had a few presentations. This is something that I care about a lot. The other thing that I care about here, and it's something that Alexei, you care about as well, we've often talked about this, is, well, we use the word configuration a lot in Nefio, and it's been, I wouldn't say very controversial, but it's been confusing because the word configuration means a lot of different things in telco and even in just the Kubernetes world, right? Because we can say that all of this here is configuration, right? All these KRM, and this is part of the configuration as data approach that leads us to really work with this specialization preparation process here. But we also know that configuration in the telco world has to do with what I call a post stand-up configuration, right? All of this is pre-stand-up configuration, right? It's about how to get the network functions running. But once they're up and running, they start to talk netconf. They start to talk other protocols that allow them not only to be configured themselves, but to be configured as part of a network service, right? So that kind of configuration, we don't entirely talk about, right? We could potentially encapsulate some of it in KRM, but we don't have the kind of technology to actually finish that kind of loop, right? So for example, with Free5GC, the way configuration works is just any files, right? So text files, and we write them as part of our process here and stand them up. But we haven't really worked yet with real world configuration of network functions. So my proposal is that we could have a component here, which is we can encapsulate our kind of configuration requirements in KRM with a flat facade, a declarative facade. So the point is to give a declarative facade to things like netconf, which are non-declarative. And yeah, I'm sorry, I'm rushing a bit here because I want to leave us time to discuss other things. There is, I wrote a POC about this. I know, Alexei, you've done some work as well. Again, I think this is like to close the loop for Nefio. And by the way, I mentioned here this adjacent PNF. Part of it is not just configuring our own CNFs. The issue is that sometimes when we deploy, part of our infrastructure configuration involves top of the rack switches, routers, et cetera, that something that I put in a group that I call adjacent PNF. So they're not specifically in the workload cluster, but if we want Nefio to completely work, right, and really do everything, if it's including for the network plane manager, might need to talk to this as well. So we need a way to talk to those adjacent PNFs and configure them. So that's why there are lines here going both to our CNF resources and to the adjacent PNF. Anyway, sorry, this has been very long, but I hope I managed to get through everything.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Tal. I'm going to take it, if you don't mind, for a couple of minutes. I have a major question about everything here, but I'm not going to open the can of worms just yet, so I'll keep it for later. But thank you very much, Tal. Wim, I think I heard you saying for next Friday, you're willing to present the current state. Is that what I heard you say?
No, that's not what I said. I'm trying to discuss because so I'm a bit traveling, so I don't have a lot of time. But
no, okay,
what I'm trying to say is that the point is the following, Alexis, right? So I don't want to dwell upon it too much, but at the end of the day, we need to get a scope for R3. Okay.
Yes.
And so my point is this: so we can look at, I call this, maybe this is not the right word, but more a very conceptual view of what we could do, right? and or at least this is Tal's view of how it could look like. That means not everybody agrees, so we could start the discussions around that track, right? And discuss it, right? And we can do in parallel maybe. The other approach is you see at the end of the day we have use cases, right? Those use cases will have demand on and on demand on changes to accommodate that, to improve our current system and make it better to accommodate for those use cases, and try to use that to build a scope for R3.
Yeah,
you see?
the main issue, so I may interrupt very briefly and I'll move on, but the main issue is the use cases, they need a baseline architecture to demonstrate what they need to bring in that architecture. And I think with what we have seen from Tal today, there are many pieces of the architecture that are current and some of them that are not current, that are to be defined. And some of the component nomenclature today is not necessarily something that is well, the level of awareness of their name or the nomenclature in that diagram is not necessarily to a level where all the people defining the user story should be. So I'm just trying to digest this and come up with what it is we have today, right? For at the end of R2, what it is we have. So then I can give that to all the user stories owners so they can take what we have today and based on their user story complement it. So that's my goal in the very short term, and I'm trying to work towards that. But so I think we're saying pretty much the same things here, but that's what I'm trying to get to in a very short time frame, so the user story owner can build the artifacts needed for us to do the actual scope and planning, which
Because
is to your point, what we need to do.
Sorry to cut you, but in our user guides, right? We have a component view, right, in our documentation.
So if you can link me to it, then it's perfect. I can work with that.
I'm not 100% sure, but I think at some point, like Eric and stuff like that, they put all the components that we have for R1. We have built a diagram that documents that. I need to dig it up, but I'm pretty sure we have that.
Okay, so that's great. Thank you, Wim. So quickly, we have 5 minutes. So Bernard, I put a document like this together so we can iterate on comment questions. I took the approach that Orion is taking on any contribution. I think that's a way we can keep track of whatever comments, feedback we have, and we'll see how we can iterate on this. Tal, I added a small version 001 here to, I don't know if you want to version this or not, but you know, I did this because I think you gave me privilege to write on your document. So just to help with tracking where the comment is coming from. So that's the two things I did. So people, please go ahead and start adding feedback comment in there, and by correlating to the various components that were presented today. I have to close it on the architecture topic for today because I need 2 minutes for the release scope. But Tal, thank you very much. I think this is a very good head start, and given we have a recording, we can share that with more people. So thank you for that. Between now and next week for the architecture, I'm going to try to figure something so we keep that discussion going. But now if we look at the release scope, and there are various things that we need to do. There are the urgent things that is defining a scope for R3, and there are the more future-looking things like what it is that we want Nephew to look at, what it is that we want Nephew to do. And so I had a discussion with Sudi, who's on the call yesterday or a couple of days ago, and we're going to meet the three of us with Sana as well to try to define these more forward-looking goals. But on the very short term, we have 6, 10, 12 user stories already submitted by the various working groups. And we need to come up with a working process on how we take these user stories and identify the impact, meaning the deliverables required for them. And that's where architecture is one of these deliverables and some others. So I won't be able to go over my thoughts just now because it's 3 minutes. Next week, we'll start with the release scope and spend some time. We won't go through all the user stories. I will just expose you to how we can maybe have a process to go through them in a way that is efficient to build a scope. In the meantime, if anyone has thoughts on processes, I'm welcoming them because I don't have the knowledge, the absolute knowledge. So I very much welcome any contribution on defining a process to how to break down the scope from these user stories or for the architecture for what it matters. And that's it. So I'll pause. I don't know if there is any questions, any feedback, any excitement. I'm very excited. I think that's the first meeting of a kind, and I look forward to more of it. So I'll pause here. Any question, feedback, folks?
So, Alex, you were saying the meeting time, are we gonna continue to keep on Fridays?
Yeah, the time is set up. It's scheduled. There is a Zoom bridge. I mean, hopefully,
The only reason I'm asking, Friday may not be a good time for many of the folks. I mean, not for the US, but many in some part of the region, it may be a holiday. So is this the only time we found? Friday?
For the short term, Bala, yes, and I'm not necessarily planning on changing that. If ever someone has some issues, please come to me or Sana, and we'll try to accommodate. But for the short term, I can't move this anymore. I mean, we need to move forward and we need to build something for R3. So please, Bala, surface the issues you've heard and we'll consider them with Sana.
Yeah. I mean, it's fine with me. It's not a personal thing, but mostly I was talking about other regions. Yeah, I think regarding the process, yeah, I can think about something. Probably Alexei and me and you can coordinate.
Okay. Anything else, folks, before we wrap it up? We're on time now. All right. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining our first call. I hope it was insightful for most of you. It was definitely for me. And we'll see you next week. And between now and then, we can chat on Slack and contribute through documents. Good weekend, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you
Bye-bye.
for the great discussion. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you a lot.